But why make this a matter of allegiance to Christianity? Why not just take what is useful in any tradition? You just mentioned Nietzsche, right? So you found some of his work useful. There's no tradition of allegiance to Nietzsche. You don't have to worry about whether or not you are sufficiently Nietzschean in order to use his wisdom. You just take from him insofar as it's useful. Why not do the same thing with Christianity? Why waste any time wondering whether or not you are a Christian or telling people that you are or not? Why not get out of the religion business and use everything that is useful in human culture, however it comes to you, in a way that's non-denominational?
Well, if that could be achieved, that would be absolutely wonderful. I would say the first problem with that is that, or the historical problem with that, is that the kind of truths that have emerged out of this lengthy mythological process, this lengthy imaginative mythological process, were first encapsulated inside the stories and the images. They weren't articulated philosophical or psychological truths of the kind that we're speaking about. Look, you can think about this like the relationship between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. So Dostoevsky and Nietzsche were very similar in many ways philosophically, but Dostoevsky wasn't a philosopher. He was a storyteller. Implicit in his stories was Nietzschean philosophy, even though paradoxically enough, Dostoevsky was a Christian. The storytellers get there before the philosophers. And you're saying now that the philosophers have got there, maybe we don't have to pledge allegiance to a canonical version of the story. And that could be the case. In fact, you see, partly Nietzsche criticized Christianity for all the reasons that you just criticized Christianity or any other creed, in a devastating manner, although he was also extraordinarily grateful to Christianity because he believed it had disciplined the European mind. And that period of discipline was necessary, a period where everything was interpreted under the rubric of a single interpretation, because that taught concentration. But Nietzsche said, well, now we're beyond that, and we're going to have to become gods of our own accord in order to withstand the consequences. And then, of course, that turned out to be very problematic for reasons that Nietzsche also prophesied, because he said that the West would degenerate both into nihilism and into totalitarianism, and that millions of people would die as a consequence of the death of God. And that's Dostoevsky prophesied exactly the same thing in The Devils, and it's exactly what happened. And I don't believe that we can get past the Scylla and Charybdis of nihilism and totalitarianism without going back to the past to find what it has to offer us, to bring it forward in an articulated manner. And of course, that's precisely why I think the discussion that I'm having with you is important, because I think that's what we're doing.
Right, but there are two ways of going back to the past. You exemplify both of them. You are going back, talking about people like Nietzsche, right? And you can throw the rest of philosophy and world literature into that bin. But then it sounds like you are also tempted to go back in what appears to be a different category of effort, which is the religious one, which is that you're holding to one side certain arguably fiction writers and philosophers as being something other than fiction writers and philosophers, and treating certain texts as something other than mere products of the human mind. And you have a lot of company, right? This is what every religious person does. But why not treat Jesus the same way you would treat Socrates?
Well, that's a good start. I think that Socrates and Jesus had an awful lot in common. But the thing about Socrates is that he's primarily a historical figure, whereas Christ may have been a historical figure. I think that the simplest assumption is that someone of that description existed, but he's also a mythological character. And the mythology is unbelievably deep. And what it is, in some sense, is the human imagination's attempt to construct a representation of the perfect man. And so Christ is the perfect man. Now, you may say, well, we don't know what that means.
You can say that Jesus was the perfect man.
Hold it, Sam. I didn't say that. I said that Christ is the perfect man. That it's different. because I'm speaking at the mythological level, is that whatever human beings can imagine as perfect in terms of the manner in which an individual could conduct himself, that's what Christ represents. I'm not claiming for a moment that that manifested itself in history. That's a different claim, and we can talk about that claim too. But
I would say it didn't even manifest itself in the Bible. If you were going to write a story about the perfect man, a fiction of the perfect man, you wouldn't write it the way the New Testament is written, and you would get Jesus to do things that he didn't do and not do things that he did do, and he would say things that he didn't say. He can get a lot more perfect than what you see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Well, okay, so let me tell you why briefly, why that story is archetypally perfect. Okay, so here's the reason. It's because, as has been agreed upon by the sages of the ages, let's say, the fundamental reality of life is suffering and finitude. And you can layer on top of that, from an existential perspective, malevolence and injustice. And that's the lot of human beings. And so here's an archetypal story. The most perfect, innocent, sinless person possible is betrayed by his friends, his countrymen, and the foreigners simultaneously for no crime whatsoever, in the most torturous possible way, and also abandoned by the creator of being himself. And he accepts that all voluntarily. You see, the reason it's an archetypal story is because you can't get beyond that. You see, it hits a limit. It's the limit of tragedy. And so that's where the perfection lies. Now, the issue is, well, what does that mean? And here's what it means.
We can go incrementally here, because I don't even buy that it's the limit of tragedy. I mean, first of all, the thing is anchored to a belief in human sacrifice. This is what is so weird about Christianity, from my point of view, is that this is not a religion that disavows human sacrifice. This is a religion that claims that human sacrifice is real and important, but there was only one that was in fact necessary and effective, and that is the sacrifice of Jesus.
Well, that's the Protestant and the Catholic interpretation. It's not so clear with the Orthodox Christians. They buy a version of Christianity that stresses more each individual's moral obligation to do the same thing.
I don't know enough about Orthodox belief to dispute that, but most Western Christians have unacknowledged at the core of their belief system this assertion of the validity of human sacrifice, right, which is insanity.
Well, it isn't insanity, Sam, if you think about sacrifice in the way that we talked about it earlier.
That's not the way it's thought about even in the Bible. He had to die for our sins, right? He is the scapegoat. He is the only effective scapegoat, and he's a hero. He's perfect in your terms because he took this on voluntarily. I mean, to go back to what you were just saying, this is not the ultimate tragedy because he did take it on voluntarily. It's more tragic if someone really gets screwed by the cosmos.
Oh, yes, you're right about that. But the fact that he took it on voluntarily is actually the part of the story that involves the transcendence of the tragedy. Because the story there, and this is a very old story, it's far older than Christianity. The story is that the best way to transcend the bitterness of life is to accept it completely, including betrayal at the hands of your friends, including betrayal at the hands of your countrymen and the foreigners, to allow that to be acceptable, to take it on voluntarily and not to be bitter about it like Cain, because you get murderous when you're bitter.
So I can go with you there, but now if that is what you find compelling in this story, I could just offer for your examination another example, another story, another tradition, which in its details is basically irreconcilable with Christianity, but it's also well subscribed. It's the Buddha and Buddhism, right? The Buddha is another example of the perfect man. He does give you a similar rationale to the one you just gave for radical acceptance of the vicissitudes of life. And yet he's far more articulate. I mean, here now we're talking about the historical Buddha who predated Jesus by 5 centuries, but who seems to have said much more that is psychologically perspicacious. And he talks exactly on that point about the nature of acceptance, what psychologically is accomplished when you do accept your experience moment to moment, and the barriers to doing that, and the way in which you should structure your life so as to be able to do that more and more moment by moment. And he presented a methodology of meditation that is, even today, almost perfectly designed. If you're going to talk about the oldest tradition of Buddhism, the Theravada, it's almost perfectly designed for export into a secular context. So you can take whole sections of the Pali Canon, and if you just filter out some of the needless repetition and some of the phraseology that treats the Buddha like the perfect world-conquering hero, who Buddhists believe him to be, and you just look at what is being said, it's almost a perfectly secular recipe for training your mind in essentially a course of growth toward the kind of acceptance you are talking about. Again, I'm not urging you to be a Buddhist. I'm just saying this is an example that is non-Christian, that does much of what you are claiming Christianity
I would
perhaps
say,
uniquely does.
well,
It invites a non-mythological relationship to it.
Only if you strip the mythology away from it. And I think actually that you make a mistake with Buddha, that a person makes a mistake with Buddhism if they do that. You see, because there's also a longing for religious experience that's part of the human soul. And for example, that's why people smoke marijuana and why they take psychedelic drugs.
And why they meditate. But again, I would argue, and this is what I argue in my book, Waking Up, you can have the most esoteric experiences that are classically interpreted as religious or mystical or spiritual without believing anything on insufficient evidence, and certainly without structuring your interpretation of these experiences along classically religious dogmatic lines or even Joseph Campbellian mythological lines. You can essentially be a scientist of introspection, and you can use drugs to do that. You can use new technology to do that. You can use ancient techniques of meditation to do that. You could even do something which seems to partake of delusional thinking to do that and just notice the outcome. I mean, there are practices like in Tibetan Buddhism, there's something called deity practice, where you imagine yourself to be a deity or a bodhisattva. And the practice of imagining yourself to be that is not the same thing as becoming delusional and thinking you are that.
That's exactly the same thing as the mystical imitation of Christ. It's exactly the same idea.
So you could do that with Christ. You could do it with Batman. You could say to someone who's shy and who doesn't like to go to parties because they just don't like each subsequent encounter with a stranger where they have to overcome their shyness and their inability to make small talk and all the rest. So shyness is a psychological problem that virtually everyone has to some degree or another. And perhaps one way to overcome it is to walk into a party just trying on the idea that you are Batman, right? That you're Bruce Wayne, right? That you have all of these secret abilities, or you're Jason Bourne, or some powerful character who...
You got it. That's exactly it.
...is capable of great things, but we know is a total fiction. So now, does that have any psychological consequence? And if so, why? I think there's no question it can have a psychological consequence and can be useful to do that. But the crucial thing there is that you can play with those kind of schema without deluding yourself. Like if at any point in that adventure, someone tapped you on the shoulder and said, "But do you really think you're Batman?" You would say no. Now, the problem is when you meet the guy who really thinks he's Batman, that's where you cross over into dangerously divisive and unsupported ideas about the nature of reality. And religion is really the only game in town when you want to dignify those ideas generation after generation and protect them from criticism. That's why the scientific attitude of speaking honestly about facts keeps smashing into religion uniquely. It doesn't smash into fiction. It doesn't smash into Dostoevsky. It smashes into Jesus, right? Because of what most people are doing with Jesus.
Yes, well, okay, so right, look, no arguments there. But let me offer you an elaboration of your idea. So let's say a kid wants to be Batman. Well, that's right, because that's why he's reading the comics, and that's why he's going to the billion-dollar Marvel movies or DC movies that portray these superheroes out on the screen. It's because the kid is acting them out in imagination, is trying on an ideal. So let's say, well, maybe you start with a pro wrestler because you're not that conceptually sophisticated, and then maybe you move to Batman, and then maybe you move from Batman to Thor in the Marvel cartoons, and there you're in the domain of quasi deities, and then maybe you get a little bit more sophisticated than that, and you try on Jesus or Buddha, and then you ask yourself, well, what would happen to the world if you tried those on completely? And that's the real question. That's where the historical element and the mythological element meet. I mean, there's obviously a hierarchy of rank among individuals, and some people have a much more positive impact on the world through their actions than others. And there's some hypothetical ultimate limit to that. If you were the best person you could possibly be in every possible way, just exactly how much good could you bring into the world? And at what point would you be a bodhisattva? That's something Buddhists ask themselves all the time. Why would you be an incarnation of Christ? Something that isn't just mythological or imaginative or delusional. It's a partial, because the ideal recedes as you approach it. But there's a reality underneath this, which is that better people are better and worse people are worse. And there's archetypal limits to both of those. So these are very complicated things. They're fiction in a sense, but I would think about them more as metafiction. They're what happens when you distill fiction into what's ever centrally true about fiction. And it's really, really true.
Well, I would grant you, and again, this is the topic of my book, Waking Up, that there are possibilities on the positive end of human psychology that very few people actualize for any significant amount of time. And people glimpse them in their best moments in life. They have peak experiences, whether on drugs or, after some crisis, or they've been fasting, or they have moments where they feel as good as they have ever felt. They feel as in touch as they ever will with just the sheer profundity of slamming into the present moment and finding it totally captivating and worthy of their attention. They're not looking elsewhere for anything. They have become identical to the feeling of being and found it to be, in some basic sense, perfect. Now, that's available to us as human beings, and there's not much of a scientific story to tell about it at the moment. It's not arrived at by understanding more about the universe scientifically. So it is, in some sense, orthogonal to all of science. But my point is that it doesn't require delusion either. It doesn't require belief in anything on insufficient evidence. It doesn't require that we believe certain books were revealed by the creator of the universe and others weren't. You can get rid of 90% of what people are doing in the name of religion and spirituality and mysticism and still find this project captivating. The 10% that you retain, perhaps, is when you hear these stories about people like Buddha and Jesus and all of the people who have made heroic efforts to be like them historically, the Christian contemplatives and Buddhist monks and all the rest, you can find in the biographies and pseudo-biographies of these people some evidence that transforming the human mind is possible. And you can find that evidence in your own life if you have the right experiences. And you can see that human consciousness is perturbable and plastic, and you need not be who you were yesterday. And so when you're talking about becoming your best self or becoming more and more like the best selves that have ever existed, or you talk about transcending the self itself as an illusion, right? All of this stuff is worth thinking about and paying attention to, and there is a there. I'm not doubting that for a second. What I'm insisting upon, however, is that we need never step off the razor's edge of real honesty and conceptual integrity, even for a moment, in order to walk in that direction. And that's, as you said, most New Agers see no problem in indulging any kind of happy talk about the significance of crystals or whatever it is they're connected to. And that's where it becomes startlingly unscientific. And that's where someone like Deepak Chopra and I can't agree about how to talk about things, because the moment we start, he hits me with, you close your eyes and you feel at one with the universe. That proves that you preceded the Big Bang. Your consciousness was there before the Big Bang. Now, of course, it proves nothing of the kind. That's where he becomes a pseudoscientist. And so what I'm arguing for is that we just remain attentive to honest talk about what we know about reality, even while we have deep experiences and seek them out by whatever means. And again, I will grant you that there are means that would amount to a kind of internal costume party where you can think in terms of myth. If you said to me, Sam, I want you to think of the rest of your day in terms of the hero archetype. What are you doing today to slay the dragon and bring back that hoarded wealth to your community? That's a pattern of thought that I have no question could have some utility, right?
Well, that's what we were doing today, Sam.
Right. But again, the crucial bit is that in doing that, I'm not making claims to knowledge about the ethereal existence of archetypes. There's no, Akashic record or collective unconscious. I'm not making claims of that kind at all in order to find this way of thinking useful. And I'm not aligning myself with any provincial tradition of myth-making, i.e. a religion, and claiming that my religion is better than others, which is, as we see every time we open the newspaper, a divisive game that we have to figure out some way of unraveling.
Right, we do. And I mean, your emphasis on clear-headed thinking, this is part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you. Certainly one of the things that you demonstrated the first time we talked was your capacity for clear-headed thinking. You're crazily incisive and laser focused. And, those are extraordinarily useful attributes. And that's partly why I thought it would be so useful for us to have a conversation. I'm an advocate of critical thinking. We have to get this right. But having said that, the abandonment of all value structures, which is, say, the postmodernist perspective, isn't a way forward, because it leads to a situation where people are going to be unconsciously possessed by far more foolish ideas than they left behind them.
You're certainly not getting that in me. I'm not advocating that we abandon value structures. To the contrary, the value that we should have in hand, perhaps before any other, is the one you referenced earlier, which is honesty on every level, because it's the only thing, when you're talking about honest speech, it's the only thing that allows us to course correct collectively. It's the only thing.
Yes, exactly.
If you're going to lie to me, then you are denying me your view of reality. And insofar as you have a view that can be useful to me, we're now playing a game that is not at all optimized for course correction. And so as a society, we need to be, and this is where your defense of free speech comes in and has been so useful, we have to be committed to defending free speech, however impolitic or unpopular or even wrong, because defending that is the only barrier to, in the limit, violence. Because the only way we can influence one another, short of physical violence, is through speech, through communicating ideas. And the moment you say certain ideas can't be communicated, you create a circumstance where people have no alternative but to go hands on you. But again, there's nothing in me that is echoing a postmodern relinquishment of a sense that there are right and wrong answers. To the contrary.
No, I understand that, and I'm certainly not assuming that you are in that camp or that you think that way. It's quite clear to me that you don't. Sam, I'm getting tired. I wanted to just say one more thing,
sure,
if that's okay with you. Well, it has to do with this course correction idea. So I'm going to perhaps leave you with another archetypal idea that you can chew on if you want. So there's an idea that's paramount in Christianity, which is a creed I understand better than mostly as a consequence of my educational history. But there's a very weird idea in that is that at the beginning of time, God spoke order out of chaos. That chaos was like a potential, and that it was the act of speaking truthfully that brought forth the proper kind of order. And that was the paradisal order that Adam and Eve inhabited. So there's this deep idea lurking in there that was drawn from many sources, that the spoken truth is what transforms chaotic potential into habitable order. And then, weirdly enough, what happened with that idea over the period of about 3,000 years as Christianity emerged from Judaism was that by the time Christianity emerged, there was an insistence that Christ was the word that God used at the beginning of time to extract habitable order from chaos. And so the idea there, it's one of the most brilliant ideas of mankind, is that by speaking the truth, you face the chaos of potential and bring forth the most benevolent possible type of order, combined with that course correction that you're describing. And I think that's the central idea of the West. Now, you can find that idea echoed in other areas, like in Buddhism, for example, and in other religions for that matter. But I believe that it reached its highest imagistic development, at least as far as I can tell, in the West. And that's also why we have societies that are predicated on the sacredness, so to speak, of the spoken truth.
Yeah. The question of why we value the spoken truth to the degree that we do is an interesting one. I think it's largely, it has as much to do with a reaction against Western religion by science and philosophy as it does with anything that came from Western religion. But I think it is something that is unraveling in the strangest of places now. So it's insofar as you and I can make common cause in defending the necessity of protecting free speech across the board, however unpopular, I think practically speaking, that's an extraordinarily useful thing to do.
Yes, well, that's the best way at the moment that we can slay our respective dragons.
Well, listen, Jordan, it's a pleasure to talk to you second time. I hope people found something of value in it. You would never imagine we disagreed as much as we did the first time around if you only heard this second conversation.
Yeah, well, sometimes some stupid persistence is useful. And, I think the rabbit hole we went down was an interesting one, even though it was painful. And perhaps, look, it was productive because it got us to the second conversation. And hooray for that. And like, if you feel inclined at some point to speak in the future with me, we'll see how people respond to this. But I found the conversation very useful, and hooray for that.
Yeah. Well, listen, so I will invite people to respond yet again, as I did the first time. And I think you and I both pay attention to Twitter. At least I pay attention to Twitter really exclusively in terms of social media. So
yeah, me too, pretty much.
Twitter's a good place to make noise at us. We have these kinds of conversations for you guys. This, as I said the first time around, you, Jordan, were my most requested guest by a factor of I don't know what, but it was remarkable how many people wanted us to talk. So we have now done it a second time. And listen, it's a pleasure. And I wish you the best of luck with your entanglements with crazy bureaucracies and everything else you're doing, because you are on the front lines of a certain kind of culture war, and it can't be easy. I know it must be stressful, and I just wish you the best with all of it.
Thanks, Sam. Much appreciated, and good talking with you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can leave reviews on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can discuss it on your own blog or podcast, or you can support it directly at samharris.org/support.